Hello, everybody. I'm Richard Moore, and thanks for listening in. It's President's Day, and so in honor of that holiday, I'm going to talk this morning about some presidents. I'm going to go back to the founding fathers and their history. The other day, I was talking about polarization, good polarization, bad polarization in American politics. But American politics has been polarizing and chaotic from the get-go, and we'll revisit some of that history first. And then for premium subscribers, I'm going to dig into some of the headlines over the last few days. That also deals with presidents. Jimmy Carter has entered hospice. He was a terrible president and a personally self-righteous man, but he did good things in life with Habitat for Humanity. And from a policy point of view, conservatives will surely appreciate the work he did with the Federal Commission on Election Reform. I want to talk about that in particular, but in the meantime, my prayers, and I hope everybody's prayers, go out to former President Carter and his family. Joe Biden today is in Ukraine. While Donald Trump has announced a visit to East Palestine, President Biden is tending to his constituency in Kiev. He has also announced over the past few days, resurrecting a line he used last year, that he wants aid to go to help fund Ukraine's pension system. So let's take a look at that pension system. And finally, from the state of Wisconsin, let's dig into the headlines. Let's go back and look at Governor Evers' budget. The Institute for Reforming Government has a good budget analysis out. We know the large egregious items that the governor announced, but there's some other elements in there, not so heavily publicized, but are damaging as well. Let's take a look at that. So first of all, to go back to the founding fathers, as I said, American politics has been nasty and chaotic from the get-go. Now, we saw Donald Trump impeached twice. We saw other calls for impeachment. President Biden has been accused of having dementia, being too senile to govern. But if we go back to the very first presidential administration, we see that the very first target for impeachment, many public calls for impeachment, was against George Washington himself. And none other than founding father Thomas Jefferson was among the most advocate and adamant about the fact that he thought Washington was unfit to serve, should be impeached and removed from office. Over the years, Washington and Jefferson, though they began as great friends, they had many, many policy disagreements. On the one side, you had the Hamiltonians, the Federalists, the big government people, and then you had Jeffersonians, Jefferson, and those who thought that the federal government should be small and limited. Washington, time and time again, sided with Alexander Hamilton, much to the dismay of Jefferson. And in fact, it became so frayed, the relationship, that after Washington's presidency, the two never spoke again. One of the big conflicts was, of course, about the establishment of a central bank. Alexander Hamilton very much wanted a central bank, the Bank of the United States, and Jefferson was very much opposed to it. Washington sided with Hamilton, and that prompted Jefferson to send a scathing letter to Washington expressing his discontent. He wrote, "I consider the foundation of the Constitution as laid on this ground, that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states or to the people. To take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power, no longer susceptible of any definition. The incorporation of a bank and the powers assumed by this bill have not, in my opinion, been delegated to the United States by the Constitution." Now, it is my hope over the next year to go back and dig into some of the great quotes by Jefferson and other founding fathers, including James Madison and others, Quotes that are very relevant to today's political universe. Of course, we still have that fundamental conflict going on, a big government versus a small and limited federal government. So many of the things that those like Jefferson warned about have come to pass today. And so quotes like this are very relevant. I hope to get them compiled and out to everybody sometime this year. But in this context, in the context of a central bank, separately beyond this letter, Jefferson made several other, I think, very resonant and relevant quotes and writings about the central bank. And one of these is, he said, if the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. And finally, he wrote this: the Bank of the United States is one of the most deadly hostilities existing against the principles and form of our Constitution. An institution like this, penetrating by its branches every part of the Union, acting by command and in phalanx, may, in a critical moment, upset the government. I deem no government safe which is under the vassalage of any self-constituted authorities, or any other authority than that of the nation or its regular functionaries. What an obstruction could not this Bank of the United States, with all its branch banks, be in time of war? It might dictate to us the peace we should accept, or withdraw its aids. Ought we then to give further growth to an institution so powerful, so hostile? Well, we know how that turned out. And then later on, there was the Amity Treaty. This was the final treaty of the Revolutionary War with Britain, bringing the war to a close under certain terms and conditions. Well, once again, Jefferson and Washington locked heads. Washington had sent his envoy, John Jay, to negotiate this treaty. In matter of fact, it was the treaty's terms were designed by Alexander Hamilton once again. So when Jay came back, this had been negotiated in secret, and then it came blossoming out into the public, and there was really a lot of public opposition, though it dwindled over time, to the treaty. Jefferson was one of those enraged, and one of the terms of the treaty was, of course, that the United States would stay neutral in the conflict between Great Britain and France. This enraged Jefferson, who was a Francophile. But overall, the terms and conditions, Jefferson and Jeffersonians thought the federal government took too much power. It was negotiating things it had no right to negotiate. And therefore, it was centralizing the government, empowering the government in a way that the federal government should not be. So they opposed this treaty. There were many, many protests in the streets, by the way. A lot of those protests were directed at John Jay. The crowds would gather and they would chant, "Damn John Jay, damn John Jay and everyone that won't damn John Jay. Damn everyone that won't put lights in his window and sit up all night damning John Jay." Jefferson himself wrote a letter to Washington in which he described Washington as senile and told him he was an apostate who was unfit to serve. He had subverted American liberty to the harlot England, Jefferson wrote. Now, this is when he began to think that Jefferson should be impeached and thrown out of office. Of course, and also, he had warned that Jefferson thought that he had become too senile and unfit for government. The impeachment drive went nowhere, and of course Jefferson became president, where he then tried to get a Supreme Court justice impeached, and he himself became the target of impeachment. All of which to say, obviously, the Republic survived, and the Republic, I think, will survive our polarizing times still. But none of this stuff, the theatrics, the impeachments, the calls of treason, It's all been going on since the beginning. It's part of the American political scene. We just need to keep an eye on it so that it doesn't get out of hand and become the bad kind of polarizing where it becomes authoritarian and dictatorial. That's it for our free subscribers. I hope those of you who listen for free will subscribe, become paid subscribers. And for paid subscribers, we're now going to take just a short break and continue with today's headlines. Thanks, everybody, for listening.